Hi and Assalamualaikum. My name is Nurul Aeqielah binti Abdul Rahim and my chip number is 047855. So today our group will going to present about the Cold War. The Cold War is a state of conflict between nations that does not involve direct military actions but is pursued primarily through economic and political actions, propaganda, acts of espionage or proxy wars waged by the surrogates. The state of hostilities that existed between the Soviet bloc countries and the Western powers from 1945 to 1991, and the Cold War was a period of political difficulty involving the United States of America and the USSR.
Lasting from the end of the World War II, the Cold War was one of the most significant events of 20th century. At its heart, the Cold War was essentially a face-off of competition between the US and Soviet Union after World War II. There are a few key factors in the emergence of the Cold War, which are tension between the two states and at the end of World War II, the ideological conflict between both of the US and the Soviet Union, the emergence of nuclear weapons, and the fear of communism in the United States. The first major factor of the Cold War was the increased tension between the United States and Soviet Union at the end of World War II. During the Second World War, the Soviet Union under the leadership of Joseph Stalin was aligned with Britain, France and the United States against Nazi Germany, Italy and Japan. At the time, the alliance was based around destroying the fascist regime in the Europe and Japanese expansionism in the Pacific. The next major cause of the Cold War was the emergence of nuclear weapons. The initial development of nuclear weapons in 1940 and 1950s is considered to be a cause of the Cold War because it increased the tension between the US and Soviet Union and caused them to enter into a dangerous nuclear arms race. The third main cause of the Cold War was the ideological conflict that existing between the US and Soviet Union. At the time, the Soviet Union was a communist nation that was based on the principle of collectivism and socialism, while the US was the modern liberal democracy nation based primarily on the principle of individualism. This difference in ideology was a major source of the conflict between the two nations because throughout the Cold War, the Soviet Union sought to expand communism to other regions and the US sought to stop it with its policy of the containment. The final cause of the Cold War was the American fear of the spread of communism around the world. The approach by Truman formed the basis of American foreign policy throughout the remainder of the Cold War in the form of containment, which historians refer to as the Truman Doctrine. Essentially, the Truman Doctrine was the idea that the US should attempt to contain the Soviet sphere of influence and the spread of communism. Many historians view this as a cause of the Cold War because it increased tensions between two superpowers and lead to several conflicts between the two superpowers.
So, in the case of the space race between United States and Soviet Union, we can see in the incident of these two nations when the Soviet launched the world's first artificial satellite, which is Sputnik 1 in October 1957, which is to set off alarm bell in the Eisenhower administration and created intense fear and anxiety among the US public that the Soviet Union had surpasses the technology achievement of the United States. In April 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first man to enter the Earth orbit in a single pilot spacecraft called Vostok 1. The Americans were not far behind because in 1 month later, in May, Alan Shepard became the first American in space, piloting a 15-minute suborbital flight, and in February 1962, John Glenn became the first American to enter the Earth orbit, and earlier Soviet successors in the space race lead U.S. President John F. Kennedy to announce the inauguration of the Apollo program, which pledged to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. So now we're moving on to the arm race between these two nations. We can see in the incident of the missile gap when Soviet achievement in the space seemed to be herald a new phase of the arm race, and it is worryingly for the US policymaker, and the technology that Soviet used to launch the satellite into space could also be employed to construct intercontinental ballistic missile, which is ICBMs, which could deliver nuclear warhead to target the United States. Many observers, including foreign policy analysts and Pentagon officials, urge the United States to further develop its own ICBM capabilities and close the so-called missile gap. And although these contemporary observers probably believe that the Soviet Union had surpasses the United States in missile technology and capabilities, also the document that were released after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, which is show that the missile gap never actually existed, and the United States had to maintain a clear superiority in missile technology even during the year of the most spectacular Soviet achievement in space.
Hi, Assalamualaikum. My name is Nur Fatin Atiyyah, and I will talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, on October 22, 1962, was a direct and dangerous confrontation between the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and was the moment when the two superpowers came closest to nuclear conflict. The crisis was unique in a number of ways, featuring calculation and miscalculation, as well as direct and secret communication, and also miscommunications between the two sides. So, beginning of the crisis, on Monday, October 15, spy plane took pictures of nuclear missiles being created in Cuba, and on Tuesday, October 16, military advisors take the picture to Kennedy, and two options are discussed, that is, airstrike and blockade. After that, on Wednesday, October 17, the US found out that the missile could go far as NW Washington State. On the next day, October 18, the Soviets say they don't have nuclear missiles in Cuba. So, on October 19, Kennedy keeps going on his campaign trip, acting as if he doesn't know. In next middle of the crisis, on Saturday, October 20, he cancelled his campaign trip because of an upper respiratory infection and to discuss conditions about Cuba. On October 21, Kennedy discussed in more detail about the blockade and airstrike. After that, on October 22, Kennedy announced he is going to start a quarantine, that is, blockade. End of the crisis. On October 23, Kennedy orders a low-level mission to inspect the sites closer. On October 24, the Soviet ship stopped at the blockade and the military alert is raised to DEF CON2. On October 25, pictures are shown proving missiles are in Cuba. After that, President Kennedy told Nikita Khrushchev to remove all missiles bases from Cuba. He ordered a blockade to block Russian ships of bringing more missiles and other equipment to the island. Nikita ordered to the Soviet field commanders to launch missiles if the US invaded. On October 28, the Russian premier did as Kennedy commanded and exported all of the missiles on ships. After that, there were no missiles left in Cuba for them to use.
Assalamualaikum. My name is Shahirah binti Razali and my matric number is 047874. So my part is about the Korean War. Korean War began on 25 June 1950, which is after World War II. And because of that, Korea was divided into Northern Communists and America was occupied by the South. The war began when Northern Korea invaded Southern Korea. The Americans came to the aid of the South following the strategy of their detention. Then the war ended basically to a dead end and President Eisenhower was able to sign a peace treaty that brought the area back to almost as it had before the war. The Korean War was relatively short but exceptionally bloody. Nearly 5 million people died. More than half of these, about 10% of Korea's pre-war population were civilians. The rate of civilian casualties in Korean War was higher than World War II and the Vietnam War.
Moving on to Vietnam War. So basically, Vietnam War was a conflict in Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia occurred from 1 November 1955 until the fall of Saigon on 30 April 1975. It was the second of the Indo-China Wars and was officially fought between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. North Vietnam was supported by the USSR, China and other communist allies. Meanwhile, South Vietnam was supported by the United States, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, Thailand and other anti-communist allies. And the war, considered a Cold War era proxy war, lasted after 19 years with direct US involvement ending in 1973. And included the Laotian Civil War and the Cambodian Civil War, which ended with all three countries becoming communist in 1975. And the United States had provided funding, armaments, and training to South Vietnam's government and military since Vietnam's partition into the communist North and the democratic South in 1954. And the tension escalated into armed conflict between the two sides, and in 1961, United States President John F. Kennedy chose to expand the military aid program. And the terms of this expansion included yet more funding and arms, but a key alteration was the commitment of the United States soldiers to the region. Kennedy expansion stemmed in part from Cold War era fears about the domino theory. If communism took hold in Vietnam, it would topple democracy throughout the whole of Southeast Asia. As Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, his successor Lyndon B. Johnson continued the work that Kennedy had started. It granted him broad latitude in handling the struggle against communism in Southeast Asia.
My name is Nur Farhanah bin Salleh and my matric number is 047986. So, as a conclusion, the year 1947 was a time of escalating heat in the Cold War. There was building tension between the United States and the USSR. The Truman Doctrine, US interaction in the Greek Civil War, the Bison, and the Marshall Plan were some of the initial moments that established the intensity between the enemy countries. The events that occurred were the basis for the rest of the war. Overall, 1947 was a steadily warming yet critical year in a period of increasing heat and hardships. The fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 put an end to the Cold War and its division, which date back to the Second World War. The fall of the communist bloc brought about the end of a bipolar world built around the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. Economic and military structures such as Comecon, which is the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, and the Warsaw Pact were dissolved in 1991. The events of the late 1980s marked the beginning of improved relations between two parts of the continent that had long been divided. That's all from us. Thank you.